Hello, dear class. Uh, as you can see, this is a little more of what I showed you last week, but I'm going to be in one place, out of sight, because a couple of you wrote to me saying how you enjoyed my little tour of the leaves coming down around my house. And I thought, yes, how nice not to have to stare at your professor's face. And I thought, well, why not combine the pleasures of not having to do that with a little reading, a final reading from our lovely book. And meanwhile, you can see perhaps there'll be some leaves shimmering down, and you'll have the view from out at the back of our house upwards on the mountainside. Sorry, that's me peeping into view, which is not my intention. And uphill a long way to the very high top of the mountain, on whose lower slopes we live in the so-called Mount Overlook Wild Forest. So I was wondering whether it was an 18th century kind of a view. Maybe not. The 18th century view was a very well sculpted, very well controlled, false nature. The 18th century specialized in beautiful artificial landscapes created by wonderful landscape artists, but not the same thing as wilderness itself, which is what you're seeing here. So really this is a very inappropriate accompaniment to Lawrence Stone's wonderful book, which itself is not very well landscaped. I'd have to say that it's probably a better example of wilderness than it is of perfect gardening. And we start off so sweetly with a defense of this at the beginning of our last batch of reading, the beginning of chapter 8, volume 8 rather, chapter 1, when he says, "But softly," a very Shakespearean opening, "but soft, hush now," is what that means. "For in these sportive plains, and under this genial sun, where at this instant all flesh is running out, piping, fiddling, and dancing to the vintage," the pressing of grapes. A good deal of winemaking still went on in the 18th century in England. It then got rarer and rarer as the climate itself spoiled. We do still have some vineyards. "And every step that's taken, the judgment is surprised by the imagination. I defy, notwithstanding all that has been said upon straight lines in sundry pages of my book, I defy the best cabbage planter that ever existed. Whether he plants backwards or forwards, it makes little difference in the account, except that he will have more to answer for in the one case than the other. I defy him to go on coolly, critically, and canonically, planting canonically according to the rules set down, the canon, planting his cabbages one by one in straight lines and stoical distances, especially if slits in petticoats are unsewed up, without ever and anon straddling out or sidling into some bastardly digression in Friesland, Fogland, both of which are what are called nonce words, Nonce, which is just short for nonsense words. And some other lands I wot of, it may be done. It's possible, in theory, in some imaginary world, that cabbages are planted in a straight line, but who wants them planted in a straight line anyway? Such is our author's rumination on the subject of things that run straight and without digression, as he would be the first to agree his work of literature does not do. And I thought we could jump to the very end, from there to the end of our latest and last batch of reading, to see how this famous cock and bull story, phrase I've asked you the meaning of in the quiz, this famous cock and bull story, how it manages to end up without actually giving us the answer to questions that we might be still wanting to ask about the outcome, above all, of the amour of Uncle Toby and the widow Wadman. He's promised us so much of it, and we never really get an absolute conclusion, which seems entirely appropriate to a novel that is possibly the longest and probably the most celebrated shaggy dog story. There's another appropriate term ever written. So although it has been argued at various points in the last 250 years that he never quite finished Tristram Shandy and intended to go back to it. There is some mention of that, in fact. He makes some mention of that. I don't think we have to believe him. But he says that when he has published a different work, the work known as A Sentimental Journey, another absolutely enchanting book about a journey to France, of which he had 2 chapters finished. In fact, when he brought Tristram Shandy to a close, with 2 more to go, that he would then return to Tristram Shandy. And we don't know whether he really intended to, but was interrupted by his last illness, or whether that's simply a very Shandian joke. So, as we reach what turns out to be the ending of Tristram Shandy, with much argument about the lives together of men and women, suddenly Obadiah broke into the middle of the room with a complaint which cried out for an immediate hearing. The case was this: my father, whether by ancient custom of the manor, Walter was what used to be called the lord of the manor. He was the senior landowner of the district, with various duties that this entailed, or as impropriator of the great tithes, impropriator being he who imposed, I take it, the great tithes. Tithes being, tithe is a word that I think derives from a tenth. This was the proportion of people's earnings that they were expected to pay to the church for the upkeep of the church and for the maintenance of the clergy. And as the lord of the manor, Walter would have been in charge of seeing that these tithes got collected and delivered to Dr. Slop and whoever else benefited by the tithes. Was obliged, as my father, whether it was just because it was an old custom of the manor, the district, or it could mean just his own of his manor house, or as impropriator of the great tithes, was obliged to keep a bull for the service of the parish, a fine thing that no longer exists. The bulls are kept and cows are brought to the bull, but they're privately owned. And I, who was a dairy goat farmer for many years, as well as being at the same time a literature professor and a novelist and a playwright, I was a quite successful dairy goat farmer, won many prizes with my goats at country fairs, and broke some records for milking quantity and quality. Believe it or not, both quantity and quality in dairy goats descend through the bloodlines and not through how they're fed, surprising as that may be. And so I was fortunate and careful in choosing the bloodlines in question, and I bred dairy goats for many years and kept them and had a largish herd. And whenever I kept a male goat, which was not often, but occasionally I did, then other people's female goats would be brought to the male to be mated, because there was really no need for everyone to keep a male goat. One male goat, like one bull, indeed, in the world of the Shandys, was sufficient to keep the local population of cows and calves going. Now my head is going to appear in... Oh yes, I'm checking the time. Obadiah rushes in, crying out that now, said Obadiah, I shall have a calf. And he's delighted about this. But there's an issue as to the day on which he was married to my father's housemaid, Obadiah this is. One was a reckoning to the other. I was able to remember, because that was the same day on which the cow was put to the bull. Therefore, when Obadiah's wife was brought to bed, Obadiah thanked God. And this leads to a true cock and bull, cow and bull story. She'll calve on Monday, on Wednesday at the latest. The cow did not calve, no. She'll not calve till next week. The cow put it off terribly till at the end of the 6th week. Obadiah's suspicions fell upon the bull as possibly the real father of his child. It's extraordinary that this novel should end with a tale of bestiality, as you call it here in America. Bestiality, we say in Britain. Now, the parish being very large, my father's bull, to speak the truth of him, was no way equal to the department. He had, however, got himself somehow or other thrust into employment, and he went through the business with a grave face, so my father had a great opinion of him. Most of the townsmen, and please your worship, quoth Obadiah, believe that 'tis all the bull's fault. But may not a cow be barren? Replied my father, turning to Dr. Slop. It never happens, said Dr. Slop, but the man's wife may have come before her time, naturally enough. Prithee, has the child hair upon his head? Added Dr. Slop. It is as hairy as I am, said Obadiah. Obadiah had not been shaved for 3 weeks. And this leads to a complicated explanation. If you have a version of the book with notes, you can follow it through as to whether the presence of hair on Obadiah's infant's scalp indicates that it was or was not born of a human father or of a bovine father. It depends whether you regard as the decisive factor the condition in which the infant is born, or the condition in which the infant, between certain years of its infancy in the womb, had hair which would then disappear before the birth. It's a complicated explanation, and it leads to Mrs. Shandy exclaiming, L-D. Lord, said my mother, what is all this story about? A cock and a bull, said Yorick, and one of the best of its kind I ever heard. So we don't really know whether this is Sterne's tribute to his own wonderful story, or to the whole business of Obadiah claiming or not claiming paternity, or allowing the bull to be the true father of his child. And at any rate, it's a real country story, such as delighted Sterne, with which we abruptly end. It would not do to end this novel with a coherent climactic closure, but rather with a little squib which exemplifies the whole tenor of the work. Do, if you're so minded, go and see the film that was made, a very humorous, constantly breaking down the third wall film, surrealist film that was made not so long ago, which is entertaining, hardly a true filmic equivalent of this novel, as how could there be unless it was incredibly long. But it's fun, and I hope you've had fun with the book, and soon I shall get you ready for a not entirely dissimilar book in French, in English, but originally in French, of which I also hope you wish you great joy, hope you'll enjoy, and by the time we're into that, these last yellow leaves will, I imagine, have come down, and you may have to put up with my face instead. All the best.